Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about intraspecific population regulation because this is E&D. Hope you're feeling healthy and well. Why don't we get started here? We're talking a little bit about modeling population growth in our last lecture. We mentioned that no population is able to grow indefinitely. If you might remember, the reason for this is, well, resources will ultimately become limiting. I mean, there's not an infinite amount of resources, so populations can't grow indefinitely, at least at an exponential rate. So as population density increases here, resource demand increases. And if the consumption of those resources is at a greater rate than when those resources can be replenished, then, well, that resource base is going to shrink. You'll have fewer resources. So the results are, well, a population that can't grow as quickly and maybe will start shrinking, either as a result of fewer births or a greater number of deaths due to those limited resources. And that brings us to one of our models that we see here. You can see that we've got population size on the x-axis. I mean, there's really only 2 points here, basically 0 and k, the carrying capacity, the maximum sustainable population size, sustainable being key. And we are modeling both birth rate and death rate here. So birth rate in blue, death rate in red. And we see the birth rate is equal to the initial birth rate minus this A times N being the population size. And death rate's a similar equation. D equals the death rate at a population of 0 plus this constant C, again, times N, the population size. And even though we have B sub 0 and D sub 0, if there are no individuals, of course, there's no one there to give birth and there's no one there to die, you really want to think of it as being, just above 0. And our A and our C, these are both constants here. You can see these are the slope of the line, So we've got a birth rate that's sort of decreasing as population size increases. And we've got a death rate that is increasing as population size increases. The same figures on the next slide, so I'm going to go over there and talk a little bit more about it. So you can see that we've got sort of 3 parts of this graph here. I mean, on the left, we have where B is greater than D, birth rate is greater than death rate. On the right, we have a birth rate that is less than the death rate, and at K, our maximum sustainable population size, birth rate equals death rate, right? So this means that when we are in this area where birth rate is greater than death rate, in other words, where N is less than K, so where N is less than K, population size is going to increase up to K. On the right side of this graph, where birth rate is less than death rate, that means N is greater than K. Where N is greater than K, this means that the population size is going to decrease down to K. And when N equals K, well, then our birth rate is equal to our death rate, and our population is neither growing or shrinking. It's, well, staying at K, at this equilibrium point. So it sort of makes sense. I mean, when the blue line is above the red line, births are greater than deaths, population is increasing. When the red line is higher than the blue line, deaths are greater than births, population is decreasing. And in both scenarios, the population size is moving towards K, our carrying capacity. So 3 parts: birth less than death, birth greater than death, or birth equal to death rate. This brings us to our logistic model of population growth. We're going to contrast this a lot with our exponential model of population growth that we saw before. We see our dn over dt, our change in size over the change in time. This equals r, our rate of growth, times n, and our population size. And we have in parentheses 1 minus n over k. So there's 2 components here. There's the Rn component, and then there's the 1 minus n over k component here. And, maybe you're really good at just looking at equations and figuring things out, or maybe you should try this just with a couple numbers yourself right now. But you'll see that when population size is small, when n is small, that means the second term, the 1 minus n over k, is, well, it's close to 1, right? So it's not really limiting that growth rate component, that Rn. But when population size is large, say when n is close to k, or even say n is equal to k, that n over k will be equal to 1. And that term, 1 minus 1, will equal 0. And this will basically slow or stop that population growth term of Rn. So we can see it's sort of self-limiting here. As we get closer and closer to k, the overall change in population over time is going to decrease. So we can take a look at the model and graphically and see how this is true here. So our graph on the left, we have a change in population size through time. So time on our x-axis, population size on our y-axis. And we can see that logistic growth gives us this characteristic S-shaped curve. This is in contrast to the J-shaped curve that we see in exponential growth. So we can see that growth rate is increasing up until a certain point, and then it sort of, well, becomes the upper part of the S, and then sort of levels off there at the carrying capacity. On the figure on the right, we have the relationship between the rate of population growth, our dn over dt, and our population size, n. And what you see here is that population growth rate is the greatest at k over 2. In other words, at half the carrying capacity. So the graph on the right makes it easier to see what you might have only been barely able to see on the left. And that's that we have this inflection point. Because prior to half of carrying capacity, that population growth rate was increasing faster and faster. But then we reach this point where it sort of tops off. And then as our n gets closer and closer to k, the right part of our logistic growth equation is really limiting the left part. So k over 2 is our inflection point. And that's also the point of our maximum population growth rate. So we can see that pretty clearly there because it looks like a parabola, inverted parabola here. So comparing logistic and exponential J-shaped, logistic S-shaped, we've got a situation here where we've got time on the x-axis, population size on the y-axis. We can compare our two curves, and we've got a k of 200 and r of 0.18, same initial population size of 30, and we can see how this pans out for logistic growth versus exponential growth. So there's no limiting factor on our exponential growth model here, and so it's not going to taper off. In the real world, though, we might have exponential growth, in certain scenarios at small population sizes when resources are abundant, but exponential growth can't continue indefinitely. I mean, there will always be some limitation of resources. Similarly, in the real world with logistic growth, you typically don't just hit your K and sit there because there's a lot of factors that affect birth rate and death rates, whether they are internal or external, intrinsic or extrinsic factors. So we'll really have populations typically fluctuating around their K, sort of overshooting it, undershooting it to some degree based on the stability of the environment as well. So this concept of K, of carrying capacity, suggests a negative feedback, as we said before, between this increase in population size and resources. So we say there is a density dependence here, and we see this density dependent population regulation. So when there's density dependent mortality, as population increases, the rate of mortality increases. The more individuals there are, the more individuals die. With our density dependent fecundity, as population increases, the birth rate decreases. So same what we saw before. The more individuals there are, when it's density dependence, we'll have a lower birth rate and a higher death rate. So these are our density dependent factors because it has to do with resource availability. There are also density independent factors as well. Things like, floods or fires, other massive mortality events that, it doesn't matter whether there's a big group of you or a small group of you. Density doesn't matter if you are, individuals are being wiped away in some sort of catastrophe. It doesn't have to be catastrophic, but those are just some examples where it doesn't matter whether you're a big population or a small population, you'll be impacted by a fire or something in the same way. So here we can sort of tease these apart a little bit and look at these three different scenarios. At the top right graph, we see that birth rate, B, is independent of population density, whereas the death rate increases with population size. So here in this scenario, our carrying capacity is maintained by an increasing mortality. In the middle, we see the opposite. Here we've got a death rate that's independent, but a birth rate that declines with population size. So at carrying capacity, we've got a decreasing birth rate maintaining it. And then at the bottom, we have full density dependent regulation. Both birth rate and death rate are density dependent. So fluctuations in both of these are going to hold the population near its carrying capacity. But the key here, you can see wherever the lines cross, our birth rate and death rate lines cross, where they are by definition equal to one another, this means population is neither growing or shrinking, and this is K. This is our carrying capacity. Whether it's at a low, medium, or high population size, it's wherever our birth rate and death rate lines cross. That is K, the carrying capacity. So I'll talk a little bit about competition, the first of many interactions we'll discuss in this class here. It's something you've definitely seen and experienced it, but you might not have ever put a definition to it. So it's some interaction that has a negative effect on both participants due to shared use of resources. Intraspecific competition. We'll talk about intraspecific population regulation here as well. Intraspecific means between members of the same species. So we've got two responses to limited resources. This is in contrast to the interactions we'll see below. We have scramble competition, where this competition has equal impacts on all individuals. So that competition affects all individuals in the same way. So at its extreme, this means that all individuals could suffer the same fate, whether they all die. So if we have a group of, we'll say, animals all drinking out of this same small watering hole, if there's a lot of animals and only a little bit of water, they're all drinking some of it, but none of them get enough to really survive. And so they're all feeling this effects of competition equally, and they might all die from that. That's the extreme of scramble competition, all individuals in that population dying. Contest competition, though, this has unequal impacts. So in other words, there are winners and losers. Sort of implied in the name contest here. So that means some individuals are able to get enough resources and sort of block out the others. So some will survive and maybe thrive, whereas others just simply won't. And so whether you're scramble or contest, usually very species specific. Certain species will have their interactions between their members will tend to be one or the other. It can change based on stage of their life cycle as well. So, if you're going through different stages of development, you might have one type of competition versus another type of competition, for instance. We also have these two types of competitive interactions. So we were talking about responses, now we're talking about interactions. We've got exploitation and interference. Exploitation is due to a direct interaction. Interference, let's see here. I think I have this flipped around. This is backwards. Exploitation is due to an indirect interaction. Interference is due to direct interaction. So the one analogy that I learned as a grad student here, say you and someone else, you've got two straws in one milkshake. Exploitation interactions would be that you're both drinking the milkshake as quickly as you can. But you're not interfering with one another. You're both just using that same shared resource. You're both exploiting the same shared resource. So a interference interaction would be like, okay, you're both drinking this milkshake, you've got your own straws, but you actively, block this other person's straw, or you pinch their straw so they can't get as much. So one has to do with, you're both using the same resource, but you're not, preventing each other from using it. You're just both going after the same thing. Whereas interference would mean you're actively blocking or preventing someone or some competitor from using that resource. So on this slide here, we've got hummingbirds. So as long as they don't interfere with one another, they're all drinking the same nectar. This would just be exploitation competition here. They're all just using the same shared resource. Whereas on the right, we've got interference competition. We can see this disturbing looking pelican, taking this fry, preventing this upset gull down at the bottom from being able to access it. So sort of a difference here between interference and exploitation. It's interference with the pelican because he's going out and grabbing it, preventing the gull from getting any at all. That is a disturbing picture. So intraspecific competition, it affects first the growth and development of the competitors. So we mentioned our density dependent birth rate and death rate. We also have density dependent growth. So in this figure here, we're looking at, looks like white clover. We've got number of plants per pot on the x-axis, and we've got mean weight per plant on the y-axis. We can see there's an inverse curvilinear relationship here. As there are more plants per pot, each plant is smaller. I mean, this makes sense. I mean, if you do any gardening, there's, spacing recommendations for plant your tomatoes this far apart, your carrots that far apart. You could, plant all your seeds 1 inch apart from one another, but there's going to be pretty intense competition between them. They're all going to be much smaller than if you give them enough room to grow, right? So as we increase density, number of individuals, well, there's going to be this response in the average size of each of them. So if you have a lot of them in one small space, each individual is going to be smaller. We can see this in another species, Atriplex prostata, just some examples with another species rather. And density is the x-axis for each of these, but we can see not only a decrease in mean plant weight, but also mean leaf area. So plants are smaller, their leaves are smaller, they are photosynthesizing less. I mean, with so many neighbors right on top of you, it's going to be hard to access light. And our leaf area ratio, so if you remember this before, is going to increase. This means because light is limiting due to being packed in there with so many neighbors, you're really just trying to maximize your surface area of your leaves. So sacrificing some leaf width for just straight leaf area. We see this not only in plants, but also in animals. Here's an example of some ectothermic vertebrates. So we've got frogs here. We see that at higher density, so number of added competitors is our x-axis, we see there's a decrease in growth rate, so they grow more slowly. An increase in activity, meaning they need to spend more time looking for food. But you also see these other things like longer bodies, shorter tails, wider mouths. These are traits associated with an increased foraging type phenotype. So what we have here is a plasticity caused because of competition, which is pretty interesting here. So these high densities can affect how they develop. If you remember, we also saw a competition-induced phenotypic plasticity before when we looked at our locusts. Once those locusts, they keep brushing up against one another, it was literally like pressure felt on their upper part of their hind legs. This would cause them to go through this sort of swarming type behavior. In these figures here, we can see an interesting effect called self-thinning, where we have not just a density-dependent growth, but a density-dependent mortality. These are kind of tricky graphs to look at, so let me break it down. In our upper graph here, we've got date on the x-axis. On our left y-axis, we have the density of surviving plants per meter squared. That's a green line. And on our right y-axis, we have the average weight per plant. That's a blue line. So we start out with a density of maybe 100,000 seeds per square meter. That's a lot of seeds. We can see that over time, the density is really decreasing. We're starting really high, close to 100,000, and then after, let's see, 6 months here, we've dropped down to a density of maybe only 1,000 individuals. But then the weight of those surviving individuals has increased considerably from being, well, they all start as seeds, of course. But those surviving individuals are able to develop and get larger over time as more and more of them are dying. On the lower graph here, this is presented in sort of a strange way. So we have density, plant density on the x-axis. Again, we see that 100,000 as our max. We have our average weight on our y-axis, going from 1 to 1,000 here. And here we've got dates associated with our different data points. And if we follow the arrows here, so starting at December 16th, we start with a density close to 100,000. Again, this is a log scale on both axes here. We start with a density of close to 100,000. Then we move to January 30th, and well, we are much less dense, but we have an increasing average weight. And then this pattern continues. So we're moving from the lower right to the upper left of this graph. As we move through time, fewer individuals, but the surviving individuals are getting larger. So this is widely seen in plants, but also sessile animals like corals or barnacles, animals that don't really travel or don't go anywhere, don't move. This is especially a well-known effect in forestry, because if you're trying to grow a forest for timbering or for any usage here, if you're unexperienced, you might say, hey, why not plant, instead of 100 trees per acre, why not 1,000 trees per acre? Why not 1,000,000 trees per acre? Because you might get the gut feeling that you could plant a 1,000,000 seedlings per acre, but you're not going to get 1,000,000 mature trees. I mean, there's a maximum number of mature trees you're going to get out of any particular area, and foresters spend a lot of time and money studying this and understanding this so that you're only going to put in as many trees as you are going to get out. Otherwise, just be a huge waste of resources. So you could plant 1,000,000 acorns there, and maybe you have 1,000,000 seedlings, but there's going to be some severe self-thinning because you can't fit 1,000,000 mature oak trees on an acre, of course. So I mentioned we can see this in animals as well. If we look at this fish figure, we've got density on the x-axis, average mass on the y-axis, and again, we're sort of following our dates. So from the bottom right to the upper left of this graph, 1987, we have high density but low average mass, and we can see that from 87 to 88, density is decreasing, mass increasing, same pattern up to 1989. We also see this in, I mentioned sessile animals here. We've got some mussels. And we see that this relationship between population density and mean individual mass. So as population density decreases, the surviving individuals are larger. So this intraspecific competition has an effect on growth rate, on mortality. It also affects reproduction. So when densities are high, female harp seals, they are going to mature later in life, but also at a lower body weight. So we take a look at this upper graph here. We've got population density times 10 to the 6th. We've got mean age of first reproduction. So because there's a density-dependent effect on growth rate, that means it takes them longer to reach a size at which they can be sexually mature and able to reproduce. So when population density is higher, we've got fewer resources, slower growth, so it takes longer for them to reach this reproductive size and age, because as density increases, mean age of reproduction increases. In our lower graph, we can also see that the percentage of mature females giving birth also decreases with increasing density. So our age of sexual maturity increases, so we have fewer females giving birth at higher densities as well. Similar pattern in plants. We've got population size and yield, or plant population density and number of seeds. And we can see that as that population size increases in soybean and in glasswort, there's fewer seeds per plant, right? I mean, this makes sense. They're all packed together. They're going to be smaller. They got fewer resources to devote to producing these seeds. We can see a stress effect as well from these high densities here. So it can trigger hormonal changes that, well, slow growth, slow reproduction. We saw these in harp seals, same with delaying sexual activity, suppresses the immune system. So you make yourself more susceptible to disease. So if a pregnant female is affected by stress, this can increase offspring mortality. This can decrease lactation, make it harder for those that are born to actually survive. And certain organisms even produce pheromones that can affect the behavior physiology of others. So rats grown in a high density, or I think it was actually maybe field mice or something, grown in a high density, their urine contains pheromones that suppress the reproductive rate of their neighbors. So they took this urine from a high density population and introduced it to mice grown in a lower density population. It slowed the growth rate even of those lower density mice. So pheromones produced through urine, exchanged through other means. This is actively limiting birth rates of your neighbors. One of the last things I want to talk about here is the Lee effect. So we've been talking about birth rates decreasing with increasing population size, or death rate increasing. An Lee effect is when we see this some density dependent mechanism that reduces the birth rate at low population densities. So in this example here, we can see an Lee effect where at a low population size, birth rate decreases. So you see this point A where the birth rate and death rate lines cross again. This is achieved through on the figure, a bending of the birth rate or the death rate line. So this Lee effect can be caused by, problems that populations face at low densities. So if densities are really low, you might not be able to find a mate. So at a very low population density, you might not be able to reproduce at all. Or if these plants are situated far apart from one another, they might not get sufficient pollination service to produce seeds. Or if you have some sort of group strategy is important, like a group mating strategy. That's what a lek is here. You can watch a video where I have sage grouse do this. You need to have a group of sage grouse to attract females to your area to begin with. So a single sage grouse out by itself, it's not going to be really that successful. Or you've got group defense, like musk oxen here. They form this sort of defensive circle around their young. So a group of musk oxen is going to be successful at defending itself, but a smaller group, is going to face much greater risks. So basically, there's this key size you need to be above in order for things like group reproductive or group defense or sufficient pollination service or even just finding mates to have that work. So we have 2 points again where B and D cross our birth rate and death rate lines. Our carrying capacity is the classic one. Here we also have an Lee effect. Notice this change in birth rate is one. You could also have the birth rate line stay straight and the death rate line increase. Maybe that'd be the case with musk oxen, for instance. Here's an example, data collected by our own Jim McGraw, looking at ginseng. And he saw a clear Lee effect where at low population sizes, so number of flowering plants being low, then the mean number of green fruits per plant has decreased. So likely due to low pollination service when these plant densities are pretty low and bees just aren't able to get enough pollen between them because they're so far apart. So I'll post this note card on eCampus. Good luck, guys, and I'll talk to you later.